I kind of cut Johan Rockström off, didn't I, which is not very polite of me. So I'm going to ask him to come on up, along with some high-level respondents to what we've heard so far, the panel declaration, the Planet Under Pressure declaration, and Johan Rockström's New Science, Future Earth comments. I'd like you to welcome a very eminent panel indeed. We have with us Achim Steiner, who needs little introduction. Come on up, Achim Steiner. Are you mic'd up? Good, excellent. Executive Director of the UN Environment Programme. We have Elizabeth Thompson with us too, the Executive Coordinator of Rio+20. She is, of course, a former Minister for Energy and Environment from Barbados. Take a seat, make yourselves comfortable, wherever you like. The Chief Executive of the UK's biggest recycling firm, Viridor, is with us. That's Colin Drummond. We have the best connected person at the whole conference, Felix Dodds here, who runs the Stakeholder Forum. You should have a look at his Rolodex. And Johan Rockström, come on up. And we're going to start by asking you to please give us your responses, short 5 minutes or so responses, to what you've heard, the declaration and Johan's ideas about the new science. Achim, could you get us started?
Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. Let me begin by, first of all, expressing my admiration, I think, for the work that Johan has just presented on behalf of an extraordinary group of people who have taken a challenge on that many would have said, don't even bother. And I think what they have managed to bring to us is not only a set of analysis, but more importantly, a set of ways forward that are long overdue. And I want to align UNEP unequivocally with, I think, the direction that Future Earth has laid out. I think it is perhaps the most significant development in this community for well over a decade and a half or 2 decades. Let me also say what you have heard from our Secretary General this morning, my colleague Irina Bokova, is that science and the scientific community in the United Nations are in some ways a far more mutually dependent set of communities than many realize. The issue of science is woven into the DNA of so many of the UN's funds, agencies and programs that people often underestimate how important science has been over a number of decades, whether it's in the work of the World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Meteorological Organization. I could go on. UNEP's own evolution and the evolution of the environmental agenda has in large part been empowered by science, and empowered by science in the sense that in a community of nations constantly in competition with one another, with conflicting and competing interests, science has often been a way of moving issues beyond, let's say, the national interest and allowing a notion of global action to actually emerge. And that, I think, is a critical part of the discourse that you are all having here at the moment in terms of looking at Rio. And I would like to, however, share 2 observations that I think Future Earth in particular picks up, but my experience also very much reflects what David Willett spoke to this morning. Science has gotten to a point where it actually is more capable, more powerful, and more competent in describing what's happening in the world than ever before. Yet when we interviewed 400 scientists through the foresight process that our chief scientist, Joe Alcamo, led, one of the top issues that emerged was the broken bridge between science and policy. And we could spend a lot of time, and you have in different sessions, asking ourselves for the reasons, but I think 2 are particularly important, which Future Earth is addressing. We cannot simply continue to just document what you also called a doomsday scenario. I think we are able to speak to the world today, but because of the complexity and because of the trends, much of what science is communicated, or the science that is communicated to society, actually leaves you almost disempowered. The complexity, the darkness of the scenarios, the constant arguments that, there are so many reasons why we cannot do something about it. I was struck by when the First Lady of Austria just spoke about children. It is one of my sort of continuous experiences when you speak to 8, 9, 10-year-olds. They intuitively understand the environmental issues so clearly, and then we become adults. And as adults, we lose the courage to actually address these issues. And why is that? Because we are constantly told that there are imperatives and trade-offs and constraints which very often lead us to something that Eleanor Ostrom and others also spoke to this morning. I think this is another key issue that the Future Earth Initiative is now addressing. it is not just about science in the sense of natural sciences. It is about not only telling people how bad things are and how good we can now describe them, it is the choices we can make. And that has a lot to do with economics as a dominant form of discourse in our society. And that is why I believe both the economy and governance are such critical areas. And the scientific community cannot only rest its case at the point of the natural, biophysical, scientific documentation of what's happening in the world. Politicians don't only need descriptions of the problem, they need answers to how to address the issue of livelihoods, jobs, employment, the future of our economies. And I was struck when in New York last week a number of NGOs put out a statement in which they said something along the lines of, we need in Rio more ecology and less economy. Emotionally, I can sympathize with that, but rationally speaking, I would say more ecology in the economy is actually what we need to look for, and that is where I think the circle closes what Johan has just described. We need to be able to give those who take decisions in our societies, those who lead our societies, elected or self-declared, in civil society, in the business community, answers that no longer accept this notion that you have to destroy the planet in order to be a well-off society. That is the ultimate logic and contradiction of living in the age of the Anthropocene. And I think we're on the verge of entering a new chapter here. Thank you.
Achim Steiner, thanks so much. And we'll explore those ideas further. Putting more ecology into the economy. Elizabeth Thompson, what will you be taking from here back into the Rio +20 process? Give us your thoughts.
Thank you so much, and I think that Planet Under Pressure, when I came this morning, everybody has been saying to me that this has been an entirely stimulating 4 days. And when I heard Johan's presentation, I understood exactly why. As to what I'll take back, I think that this morning reinforced, and certainly Johan's presentation did, a sense that all of us are partners in Earth Incorporated and have a responsibility to look after the patrimony that is ours. And I want to share with you, apart from what I'm taking back, some of what we are doing in the preparatory process for Rio, because I know that many of you are in fact curious about that. Over the course of the last week, there have been very intense negotiations going on in New York. And in relation to science, at the end of the evening before, today is Thursday, is it? Yes.
If it's Thursday, it must be London.
At the end of Tuesday evening, there were 4 recommendations which really served to help to integrate and reinforce the notion of sound science supporting policy formulation and strengthening policy formulation, enhancing our understanding of what the planetary boundaries are, what are the critical thresholds in relation to the way we live, do business, work, and operate, and how do we develop what Johan referred to as actionable research that supports improved quality of life, ensuring that there is sustainable development and poverty eradication, while at the same time protecting the planet. Those 4 recommendations coming from the countries, some of which reinforced the report of the Global Sustainability Panel, were that the UN should appoint a post or establish a post of chief scientist, that we should have a set of sustainable development goals, that the Secretary General should appoint a panel that will deal with sustainable development and will be a science-based panel, and that he will embed or should embed into the UN a new mechanism for being able to evaluate and report on the state of the planet and countries' efforts to attain sustainable development and reduce poverty. These are critical recommendations because they do not only speak to a new contact between worlds that spun on different axes, those of politics and science, but bringing them now into each other's gravitational pull with an increased level not merely of contact, but of collaboration, so that all of us are better able to understand issues of sustainable consumption and production, or individual roles, and how science can then support policymakers as they make decisions that impact on the welfare of us all. And Rio Plus 20 is going to be an important platform, not merely for global dialogue, but for catalyzing the kind of change that the words that you put up at the beginning, the word that stood out was change, for catalyzing the kind of change that will lead to a global green economy and transform what we do now in terms of making it entirely about consumption, but making it about how we preserve people's lives on the planet which we all share. Thank you so much.
Great images. I love that thing about gravitational force fields. Well, conference, I must tell you that we've done that word cloud thing again on all the questions that have come in today, and the focus has shifted. From the biggest word now isn't change, it's agreement, which really tells you something, agreement. And so I'm going to ask Colin Drummond, how can business make sure that it's on the same page as all this, in agreement with scientists and policymakers? Give us your response.
Right, well, I'm a businessman, been in water and environment sector, waste management for 20 years. I'm really honoured to be here because I think 10 years ago, I wouldn't have been invited. I also do a bit of work with David Willits, and he's stolen my thunder on various pieces, so I'll leave that out. But within the LWEC programme, we've talked a lot about working across scientific disciplines. The other thing we're trying to do is get a structure where business is involved in co-design of research projects. Because one of the things we've found is if science are working in one corner, business working in another, and then science just comes and leaves on the desk fascinating, very important findings, but there's no buy-in in the design of the research, it often isn't taken forward. So I welcome strongly the comments about co-design that have emerged in this conference. And funnily enough, what we've found is in some areas, business are actually leading the charge. Often business are criticized for being conservative, and in many cases we are. But for instance, in the advisory board I talked about, we've led the agenda on things like excessive world resource use. And we as business people think it's scandalous that we've used as much resource in the past 50 years in the world as in all previous history. And we can see it affecting our business. So businessmen, I think, aren't all people with horns and would be keen to work with science. Second point in the response, I think sustainability is becoming mainstream among many business people at present in the UK. Now, I've always learned that there's the three legs of sustainability: environmental, social, economic. The first two are getting a very high profile, rightly. I think the concept of economic sustainability needs pushing much harder. It's a very powerful tool.
What do you mean by that, Colin? It needs pushing much harder?
Well, look at, I take the example of the debt crisis we've entered into, and as a businessman, I see unsustainable financing models that have led a lot of companies getting into financial difficulties and countries. I think all of us who preach sustainability should actually say part of what we're preaching is economic sustainability, and businesses should be thinking about their long-term future. It's a powerful message that we should make more of. The other point that strikes me strongly is it's very important to have the structures where we have science, the different elements of science, including the social sciences, working together, and also a partnership with business, with co-design, and a partnership with policymakers and other stakeholders, genuine partnership. But we've got to do that without imposing a bureaucracy, because my experience of the past 20 years is bureaucracy prevents new ideas coming forward. This is a heretical comment I'm about to make. But if you look at test cases of UK water and environmental industry over the past 20 years, and I'm an old man, you can see from my grey hair, so I've lived through this. Water, highly regulated. We've invested £90 billion in the UK water industry over the past 20 years. We've achieved huge improvements in water quality, no doubt about that. It was massive improvements in water and sewage treatment quality. We've achieved it very cheaply, so huge achievements. But actually, we've achieved it at the cost of hugely increasing CO2 emissions. And we'll have to ask the question, is the water industry robust to deal with current drought levels? So I threw that in. That was a very bureaucratic approach, thought about very hard by serious politicians. It's achieved a lot, but has it achieved everything we want? I contrast that with some facts on the waste industry, which I also know a little bit about, where we didn't have a bureaucratic approach, but simply said, landfill is too expensive. It doesn't make sense throwing stuff in landfills. What the waste industry, with that one incentive the landfill tax has delivered, is 60% carbon reduction, best of any industry in the UK, 5-fold increase in recycling, 6-fold increase in renewable energy generation. What I like particularly, profits for my shareholders, so it means I'm still in a job. But there's a message, I think, somewhere there, if we can avoid too bureaucratic a solution and let there be positive conflict in ideas, which as scientists you're all used to, ditto as business people, we're used to positive competition. So my third plea is let's avoid turning it into bureaucracy, because fundamentally I think I'd end with saying, A, it's about getting the structures right, but B, I think it's more important almost to get attitudes right and people talking to each other. So thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Colin. Yeah, and Viridor demonstrates you can deliver to your shareholders and to the planet simultaneously. Now, I introduce Felix as the best connected man in the room. You're right at the center of various stakeholder dialogues. Give us your perspective and response, Felix.
It's interesting. I can't resist but to comment on your contrast there. I mean, you could contrast it with the banking industry, which had a lack of regulation. And I think, we have to be very, very careful about this. I mean, we saw with the banks where they privatized the profits and socialized the losses, and we're all suffering from the impacts of a lack of regulation, a lack of bureaucracy. So let us not forget that as we move to deal with the environment. And I think it's very encouraging that Aviva and HSBC and others are calling for a convention on corporate sustainability at the UN, and it is part of the discourse for Rio+20. I think that the policy briefs that were produced by the scientists, I think, were excellent. And they were perhaps the only stakeholder group that really ensured that the input to the regional process and to the Global Sustainability Panel was done in a coherent way. And I really do admire and support the work that was done. I think that the declaration, we saw some very important indicators of where the science community thinks we should go. And the support for Sustainable Development Goals, I think, is critical. I think we recognize that perhaps the lack of implementation of Agenda 21 and the Johannesburg Plan of Implementation maybe would have been helped if we'd have approached it from a goal-based, then supported by sets of indicators. And I think the science community has a huge role to play once those goals are set in helping to choose the right indicator baskets for each of those goals. And if you take the suggestions from the governments of Colombia, Guatemala and Peru that we would like to see those goals agreed by Rio and that the indicators would be agreed within the next year after Rio, then there's a lot of work to be done, and I think that's very important. We need an institution at the top of the UN which can integrate sustainable development. And the institution we had, the Commission on Sustainable Development, had some great first years, but clearly has run into the sand. And the suggestion of a Sustainable Development Council, I think, is a critical one, similar to the Human Rights Council at the center of the UN process. And the idea in the panel report of a Sustainable Development Outlook report, which the Secretary-General just mentioned, and which to some extent builds on the excellent UNEP GEO report, which is one I think the best reports produced in the UN system would be important. But it would need a kind of intergovernmental panel on sustainable development to help bring in Future Earth, the IPCC, the IPBES, and maybe this Future Oceans panel. Otherwise, the danger is that there will be fragmentation in the science in the UN system, and I think that would be a real danger. I think the issue around planetary boundaries, which Johan has put on the table, I think is absolutely important. But it needs to be underpinned by social foundation. And I think if anyone hasn't yet read the paper by Oxfam on the donut, it's well worth having a look at. And they've drawn very much a social foundation by which countries should work for. And maybe it isn't moving people out of poverty that we're looking for, but we're looking for a world that can have 9 billion middle-class people. Shouldn't all of us be able to live in a particular way that's not just out of poverty, but is actually at a level which we would like to see? So I think the challenge is not only that Future Earth has brought together I think an important platform, and that it needs to deliver in 10 years, it needs to deliver now. So there's a short-term issue. For Rio, there's a medium-term issue in ensuring that people understand the urgency, because it is time for change. We can't wait another 20 years. Rio set us a very good blueprint in 1992. The problem has been a lack of delivery. And, you know, to some extent, I sit here as an embarrassed British citizen, where my Prime Minister has yet to announce that he's going to go to Rio.
Well, Felix, there's 2 months to go, so there's all to play for yet. Let me put some questions to you, because they're coming in thick and fast. And we've had so many ideas that you've come up with, new institutions, the role of business, actionable research. I like that phrase. Let's start with the role of science, shall we? Johan, here's a good question from Postdoc Under Pressure.
Love it.
I thought you'd like that one. Come through the webcast. We hear so much about reaching out, but all the academic incentives actually work against reaching out to other sectors. Even in disciplinary science, can risk your career in certain disciplines. There's been no discussion on how to enable and reward scientists to take time to engage other communities in non-academic fora without risking their careers, apart from, ouch, talking about it at conferences. How do you respond?
Yeah, well, it's not Future Earth's mandate to try and change the university structure and career pathways for academics in the world, but I think Future Earth and the kind of dialogues we're having here pushes the agenda forward and also puts pressure to open windows for young scientists to make brilliant careers also as interdisciplinary scientists. And I think one should recognize that, of course, we want to continue and we need to continue to preserve and invest in the disciplinary excellence. But I think we're seeing a very significant evolution towards recognizing the quality and importance and publishability of also interdisciplinary science across the world. And we're seeing, I mean, every prestigious university in the world today has some form of integrated global sustainability center or sustainability science initiative, which try to connect different faculties and groups. So I think we're seeing a positive development there, but it's going too slow. So of course, a postdoc under pressure, I know many postdocs under pressure, and also PhD students under pressure, so that's enough.
And how about this question that I put to you earlier? It's actually from Heba Haddad, and she sent it on Twitter, which is, bringing together natural and social scientists sounds great, but do traditional, in inverted commas, scientists actually value the contributions of social scientists?
Yeah, I think here, of course, we have a challenge, but I'd like to reframe it a little bit as follows. Natural science has shown that we need to fundamentally shift our social science perspectives. So we need to reconnect our societies with the biosphere. We need to shift away from the perception that environment is some kind of externality. I mean, I think there's a good argument even to say, let's scrap the whole idea of the environment and simply think about human security, human development, human prosperity, upon which the biosphere forms the foundation. And we're learning that the biosphere is not some kind of static thing that changes gradually. It's a very complex, interacting system which actually serves society in a fantastic way, but also provides surprise and shocks. And the new social science that emanates from that dynamic understanding of the Earth system is I think, the social science of global change. And natural scientists, I find, are very keen on making that bridge. Not all, and why should all? Because some natural sciences need to say, be given space to also dig deeper in the clean natural sciences, as it were, but that there is a much, much stronger willingness to bridge that gap, and that perhaps sometimes the challenge is actually the reverse, to get the social sciences to step in and properly and fully engage with the natural sciences. And I recall so well at the early stage of the visioning process, Oren Young sitting and reflecting on the opportunities here, saying that perhaps the biggest contribution that we make through Future Earth is the next intellectual revolution, namely to integrate social and natural sciences.
Well, personally, as a journalist, I think the biggest contribution you've made is to get rid of all the acronyms and simply call it Future Earth. You can't shorten that. Thank you, Johan. We've had loads of questions about how do you create a paradigm shift, how do you create a change in expectations. And this one, I think, is particularly interesting and timely. And I'd like to ask you, Elizabeth, for your response to a question from Jeremy Carter from Creating Opportunity from Crisis. And he says, if the critical decade that we're in is characterized by slowing economic growth, which it is this an opportunity or a challenge for achieving the radical paradigm shift that we're all calling for?
I think that it's both, and it's a question of the mechanisms that we use to get there. I want to speak to some of the issues, and again, forgive me if I keep going back to where we are on Rio, because I know people are really curious about it. One of the things that people are, the negotiators and countries have been discussing is developing a GDP plus measurement, which will capture exactly some of those issues, to go beyond factors of production and deal with ecological issues and deal with social issues, because this entire measurement, that we look at where the economic difficulties are, that we determine how we make it better, that we look at means of making economic growth sustainable, that we look at doing that without causing further destruction to the planet. Those are our critical measurements and critical indicators, and GDP Plus is going to help do that. One of the things that we just did was to launch on March 1st a higher education sustainability initiative, and it goes back to the previous question as well, in which we're asking universities to look at teaching sustainable development as a module across all disciplines in the university and business schools, so that you get this cross-fertilization and this true connection between ecology, economy and society. There is also, and Felix mentioned it, the Sustainable Development Goals, which are intending not only to focus on economic issues, but to focus on a set of goals which are universal, which apply to developed and developing countries alike, and which deal with the integration of these three pillars of environment, society, and economy.
Thank you. Achim Steiner, I'd like to draw you into a subject which you might find a little delicate, and it's the discussion that's been going on about institutional frameworks here. On the one hand, we have a question from someone like Alina, for instance. Where is it now? Have I lost it? Youth for Rio Plus 20. What are your feelings about UNEP's future after Rio Plus 20 restructuring, reorganizing? On the other hand, we have people like Laurent Tubiana, who said to us yesterday, actually, it's not about changing institutions. We shouldn't be putting our focus there. It's about changing expectations. Where do we put our effort? Could you give us your thoughts?
Well, maybe the truth, as always, is in some form of symbiosis. I think if people discuss today something that has to do with an institutional upgrading in a United Nations world, for most people it's almost an esoteric discussion. But let's go back to 1972. I mean, institutions and the mandates and the empowerment they're given are an expression of social and political preference. So if we believe that multilateralism is a critical part of having this community of 7 billion people be able to work together on these issues, then surely we should care about the effectiveness of these institutions. And let me be very honest, I mean, I have now been Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme for 5 years. It's a wonderful job, but it's an institution that was conceived out of a compromise in 1972. It has never been fully empowered, and time and again at these summits, people are bringing the question, we want to have a more effective environmental governance platform where the ministers of environment of the world are actually able to exercise governance. Now, that is a political choice, and I think in Rio, you know, how esoteric it may sound to some, the decision to either leave the environmental governance agenda in the box of 1972 or to finally give it an expression that is at least equivalent to, as you know, your colleague Brice Alon said, we have an organization on tourism, on health, on women, on agriculture, and yet environment remains a program that doesn't really have decision-making authority, where the environmental governance landscape is so dispersed today that we take thousands of decisions at Conference of the Parties, and then we are surprised.
I think that's the plea for beefing up UNEP. Is it not?
I think to me it's not about UNEP. UNEP as a secretariat is simply a support infrastructure. The question is, do you want the world's ministers of environment, who are the strongest advocates for greater environmental sustainability, not the only ones, but they are the ones who, when the things come to a head, will stand up for an environmental sustainability argument. Do you want them to be a third-order minister forever? And you want international cooperation to be a third-order issue where in the General Assembly in New York, environment will always come after X, Y, and Z. And yet here we are talking about a planet under pressure. I ask you, if that is not part of the agenda, then are we not pretending that knowledge alone and the illumination of science will somehow bring salvation? No. There is a hard battle going on in the world about the future of our planet, in which economic interests, environmental interests, social interests are pitted against each other. Now, my vision is not one of competition, but certainly not to continue to impair the truth to actually be represented at that level.
I think on that very positive note, we're going to wind up this open panel session. We've got loads more questions here. Please come and grab Colin, because I know there are lots of questions on business that have come up here, which I haven't had a chance to put to you. Lots of questions about stakeholder engagement. Make sure that you get into that Rolodex of Felix's. Thank you very much to my eminent panel, Elizabeth Thompson, Achim Steiner, Colin, and Felix, and Johan, of course.